Well, welcome to the AI, ML, and data science track of DataCon LA 2021. Our next speaker is Danny Kim, who is the senior data scientist at WIP Media and a visiting researcher at USC Annenberg. His talk today is titled Too Much Drama Already, Too Much Drama and Horror Already, the COVID-19 Pandemic's Effect on What We Watch on TV. So without further ado, please welcome Danny.
All righty. Thanks, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. So hello, everyone. Thanks for making time to come to my presentation today. I'm really excited and honored to be speaking with you here at DataCon LA. Today, I'll be discussing with you some of my research on how TV consumption changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, as observed in data from WIP Media's app TV Time. Just to give a little background about myself before I get started, I'm currently senior data scientist at WIP Media and visiting researcher at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Prior to my time at WIP, I completed my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School, focusing my research on how people perceive movies to have personalities and are drawn to those with personalities similar to their own or who they aspire to be. During my doctoral studies, I worked for the Department of Future at Paramount Pictures and received my master's in statistics from the Wharton School. Before that, I received my bachelor's degree from the USC School of Cinematic Arts and worked as a project manager for a psychology and marketing lab at USC. As you can imagine, coming from both a film school and media effects research background, I really love entertainment media all around as both a creative art form and scientific subject. And it's been a real pleasure to put my broad knowledge of media to good use in revolutionizing streaming content licensing at WIP Media. So today, as I stated, I wanted to share with you the findings from an analysis I conducted using data from WIP Media's first-party entertainment consumption self-monitoring app called TV Time, available for both iOS and Android if you'd like to check it out. I'll get started by giving some background on the state of research about how the COVID pandemic has affected various facets of human life, including media consumption, as well as what past research tells us about how we can expect media consumption to change in times of social and economic uncertainty. Then I'll outline the research question as well as the methodology behind the study I conducted before proceeding to share with you my findings. We'll then wrap up by going through the key findings, discussing some potential future directions for research, and taking any questions you may have. I'm happy to answer questions, of course, but in recognition of the fact that some of you may be on a tight schedule, I do ask that you hold your questions until the end so I can make sure I get through as much of the content first as possible. Excuse me. All right, so let's dive into a high-level overview of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected society and how we can expect media consumption to change in times of socioeconomic distress. As I'm sure we all remember, this is like, the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic is a primary experience for all of us. As I'm sure we all remember, the World Health Organization declared the spread of COVID-19 a global pandemic on March 11th, 2020. Though definitely a very recent phenomena, the research literature already highlights the COVID-19 pandemic's wide range of effects. As we might expect during the pandemic, movement outside the home decreased, job search behavior increased, sexual behaviors decreased but diversified, people's body weight went up, mental health overall worsened. Scientists expect lingering physiological and psychological fallout from the pandemic for years to come. Now, of course, many of these so-called effects of the COVID-19 pandemic don't actually directly result from viral infection or spread, but are instead a response to the stay-at-home and social distancing policies and norms adopted in response to the spread of the virus. So it should be noted that any references to pandemic effects or COVID effects or the like, I herein make are used as shorthand for these indirect effects, not to imply any kind of biological causality. So, unsurprisingly, and as expected based on research about how people use media to help them cope with stress and lift their mood, millions around the world turned to media during the pandemic. As I'm sure many of us can attest to firsthand, the pandemic led to increases in media consumption across a range of formats, as you can see here. People use social media, TV, streaming video, and did more binge watching than ever before, driven by stress and needs for escapism. And such differences were observed in a variety of countries around the world. Okay, so people consume more media during the pandemic, but how might the content of what they consumed have changed? Past research suggests that people's media consumption may be influenced by a desire for safety, understanding, and sense of control over their circumstances. For example, researchers have found that inducing thoughts about mortality and death can lead individuals to display a preference for shows with law and justice themes. And it might be similar desires for safety, control, and understanding that, for example, led to the movie Contagion's boom in popularity earlier in the pandemic. People wanted to better understand the world around them as it was taking place, and they chose to turn to the film to hopefully gain that understanding. Researchers have actually taken this kind of lens to examine media consumption over the course of multiple decades. The environmental security hypothesis suggests that people tend to turn to content with mature and meaningful themes in times of social and economic distress to help control their uncertainties and worries. But when times are better, they no longer need to do so and turn to more typically fun content. These patterns have been observed in TV consumption, where between the 60s and 90s, people tended to consume more TV content discussing serious issues during times of social strife, as well as in music consumption, where slower, more romantic, and comforting songs are more popular during periods of social and economic duress. So we know that existing research tells us people consumed more media during the pandemic, but that's not exactly the most surprising. However, what has been surprisingly limited is research on changes in what kind of media people consumed. We know people watch more TV, but what did they watch more and less of on TV? There is one study that tried to get at this by measuring the extent to which people watch pleasurable or meaningful content. But aside from the fact that pleasurable and meaningful aren't exactly the most specific descriptors, that study also measured consumption by using a 7-point Likert type scale, which isn't exactly a precise measure of consumption because you're basically being asked like, how much did you watch this type of content? Very much or not at all. So I decided to run a study that attempts to fill these gaps in what we know about how TV consumption changed during the pandemic, specifically by examining how the prominence of various genres changed in people's TV viewing history during the pandemic compared to prior to the pandemic. Alrighty, so let me briefly outline for you the design of the study as well as the data source. The primary time windows of interest for this study were determined relative to the March 11th, 2020 pandemic declaration by the World Health Organization. The pre-pandemic window contained the 2 months immediately prior to the declaration. The early pandemic window was the 2 months immediately following the declaration. And the new normal window was a 2-month period, roughly 5 months into the pandemic. For the users in our study, for each time window, I also gathered their TV viewing data from parallel windows in the 3 years prior to facilitate seasonality adjustment, which I'll further detail in an upcoming slide. Speaking of users, the data I examined came from WIP Media's first-party entertainment self-consumption monitoring app, TV Time. TV time allows users to keep track of the TV shows they watch at the episode level. Now, recognizing that results at the episode level could be biased by differences in episode count, length, and as well as genre associations with such factors, I distilled down the data to the unique user show level prior to analysis. The study was limited to about 230,000 users who had tracked at least one show in each of the 12 time windows I just outlined, provided demographic information, and were from one of the countries with at least 10,000 users fitting the above criteria. The user show level data was then further aggregated to user time window level genre proportion data, with each row in the dataset representing, for a user in a particular time window, what proportion of shows they had tracked in that time window were marked as falling into a particular genre. Now, let's discuss the outcome variables of interest that were generated from this user time window level genre proportion data. First, by construing these lists of user time window genre proportions as vectors, it becomes possible to calculate Euclidean distance between a pre-pandemic genre vector and a mid-pandemic genre vector. This Euclidean distance is what I refer to as viewing profile change. But of course, questions would then arise as to whether such changes might not simply be typical viewing profile changes occurring between parallel stretches in any year. To account for such concerns, I calculated the Euclidean distances between paralleling windows from the prior 3 years. So if I want to compare pre-pandemic, which is like if I want to compare pre-pandemic to the early pandemic, I would not only look at the change between those two periods, but then basically look at the change between the parallel periods in each of the 3 years prior to it, and then subtract the average of those three Euclidean distances from the change in the primary window between the primary windows of interest to get a seasonality adjusted viewing profile change measure. Similarly, once we have user time window level genre proportions, it's easy to calculate genre consumption change between 2 time windows in 2020 for a given genre through simple subtraction. But again, to account for potential seasonality effects, I calculated the genre consumption change between the paralleling windows in 2017, 2018, and 2019, averaged these values together, then subtracted this average from the genre consumption change value in 2020 to arrive at the seasonality adjusted genre consumption change value for the particular genre. All right, so now that you have an idea of how the study was conducted, let's move on to the findings. Once more, I looked at TV show consumption data from about 230,000 users of the TV Time app. Nearly 2/3 of the users in the study were women, and over half of them hailed from France and Brazil, with the rest coming from Italy, United States, and Saudi Arabia. Given how many of the users were from France, they were used as the baseline country for the country variable in regression analyses. The median age of the users examined was 25. Let's discuss the viewing profile change analysis first. This consisted of 2 regression models, one with the what I call SVPC, the seasonality adjusted viewing profile change, one with the SVPC between pre-pandemic and early pandemic as outcome, and the other with the SVPC between pre-pandemic and the new normal window as outcome. We see a range of country main effects and interactions in both the early pandemic and new normal model. However, persistently across both models, we see main effects from gender and age, such that men and older individuals show greater viewing profile change than do women and younger individuals. We also see that across both models, there is an age interaction with the Italy country indicator, such that older individuals in Italy show even more heightened viewing profile change. However, these effects while all statistically significant and interesting to observe, should be taken with a grain of salt, given that both models present relatively low variance explained. All right, so let's move on to the genre consumption change analysis, and this is where things start to really get interesting. First up, we have the genre consumption change comparison between the pre-pandemic and the early pandemic. Now, all of these changes were significance tested using Wilcoxon tests, and all of them are statistically significant, even with the p-values Bonferroni corrected. So let's talk about practical significance instead. What you want to focus on here, in this slide and the two upcoming, are the green bars, which are the seasonality adjusted genre consumption change values obtained by subtracting the typical seasonal change represented by the orange bar here from the raw change represented by the blue bar here. We see that adventure, drama, fantasy, and horror all dip a good bit, while crime and thriller shoot up in prominence notably. These big changes are accompanied by more negligible changes in other genres. In looking at the pre-pandemic versus the new normal comparison, we see some stark differences compared to the previous comparison against the early pandemic. Once more, raw genre consumption change is in blue, the average seasonal change is in orange, and the seasonality corrected change is in green. And here all the significance tests, except for the one for comedy, are statistically significant. So once more, we should just consider practical significance. Looking at the green bars, in contrast to the early pandemic comparison, we can see action is sharply up, so are mystery, science fiction, and suspense. But there are certainly some consistencies with the prior comparison as well. Drama is still down 8%, horror is down 4%, and adventure is down as well. Indeed, because of the sheer volume of comparisons we're making here for each of these genres, it becomes more important to focus on the changes that are consistent in valence and in direction and scope across multiple analyses. Let's look at one last comparison here. Here we have in blue the genre proportion during the new normal time window. So basically, during the new normal time window, what proportion of shows people watched fell into that genre on average. And then in orange, we have the average genre proportion in the parallel window from the 3 years prior. So basically what I just said for the 3 years prior averaged together. And then in green, we have, once more, blue minus orange. The other genres vary in scope and direction across all these comparisons, but once more, we see that adventure, drama, and horror are down, as they have been across all of the comparisons. They are very consistent in all these comparisons. So, across all three comparisons, drama is down 8 to 11%, horror is down 4 to 5%, and adventure is down 3 to 4%. These are, however, absolute percentages, meaning the raw differences in percentage of shows marked in people's viewing history as drama or horror or adventure. By themselves, they're a little difficult to interpret because, for example, an absolute 3% drop means pretty much nothing for a genre that tends to occupy 90% people's viewing history. However, for a genre that tends to present as 6% of people's viewing history, a 3% drop, a 3% absolute drop is a 50% relative drop. And indeed, we do see that the absolute drama, that while the absolute drop for drama is the biggest relative to its average proportion in the data set, the 8 to 11% absolute drop is only a 12 to 16% relative drop. On the other hand, the 4 to 5% absolute drop for horror presents a 46 to 57% relative drop given the genre's 8.8% average prominence in the data set. Similarly, the 3 to 4% absolute drop for adventure actually presents a 16 to 22% relative drop compared to its 18.5% average prominence in the data set. So, okay, so we're in the home stretch. So let's do some recap and let's get to the questions. So we saw comparisons in viewing profile change and genre consumption change between the pre-pandemic and early pandemic, as well as the pre-pandemic and the new normal time windows. In the case of genre consumption, I also compared genre consumption during the new normal with the parallel windows in the year prior. Once more, focusing on consistent effects given the sheer number of comparisons we're making. In the viewing profile change analysis, we found that men and older individuals consistently showed greater viewing profile change during the pandemic, with the caveat being that the models explain relatively little bit of variance. On the genre consumption change side, we found that across all three comparisons, drama, horror, and adventure shows decreases that were consistent in direction and scope. Horror in particular showed a sharp decrease when we consider relative proportions, with the genre becoming half as common in people's viewing history during the pandemic compared to prior to the pandemic. Now, no study is perfect, and I can see how the findings point us to some interesting directions for additional work given the limitations. First, the present study didn't take into account differences in availability of titles, platforms, and titles on platforms across time. Different platforms carrying different titles have become available at varying points throughout time, and the content available on these platforms is constantly shifting. As those of you who've fallen in love with a movie on Netflix and become crushed to find out it was gone 2 months later would understand. Consideration of this kind of availability data as well as release schedules during the pandemic could have provided some more nuanced insights. Second, the findings both support and conflict with past research on how to expect media consumption to change during times of social and economic distress, with both drama and adventure, which you kind of feel are opposing things in terms of how fun they are, with both drama and adventure becoming less prominent during the pandemic. It might be worthwhile for future studies in this area for future studies on media consumption during times of socioeconomic distress to consider whether the nature of such distress matters in terms of impact on media consumption. So, for example, the pandemic inherently has a biological, medical nature to it in ways that, say, for example, the 2008 recession does not. How does such biological or medical themes being present in people's minds, in addition to the socioeconomic distress itself, affect changes in people's media consumption compared to a socioeconomic distress event that doesn't have such biological medical primes associated with it? And lastly, other studies examining media consumption during the pandemic often considered various psychological measures such as stress and anxiety. The inclusion of such measures and other psychological measures such as personality might provide greater insight into what types of audiences shift their consumption most during times of distress. All right, so that's almost it for me. I just wanted to give a quick shout out for the home team. If you like the idea of spending all day crunching data about what people watch on TV, and we also work with the movie data too, we have a lot of open roles on the data team here at Wood Media, like the ones you see here. If you see anything you like, you're highly encouraged to apply. And even if you don't, feel free to reach out to see if there might be something coming up the pipeline. Our data team is growing rapidly. And that's it for me. Thanks, everyone, and an extra grateful shout out to the DataCon LA organizers and our session hosts, Ron and Brimmoy. I'll now take questions.
So if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A tab, and I see that we have some. Brimmoy, would you like to do the honors?
Sure. So first question from Sean is the paper published? If so, can you give us the citation info?
Hey there. Yeah, thanks for the question. So right now, actually, the paper is still undergoing revision. If you add me on LinkedIn, we can keep in touch, and I'm happy to send out the paper once it's officially like published. As for is Netflix data available? So obviously, we don't have like first party Netflix stuff because we're not Netflix. But the TV Time app, basically like people can mark content they've seen in the TV Time app, regardless of what platform it's on. In fact, the app actually has functionality that tells people where they can watch certain things, whether it's Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, or a plethora of streaming platforms that are available across the world. So there would have been some Netflix associated consumption on Netflix, uh, data on such things included in the analysis. Yes.
Any further questions? What kind of regional differences did you find?
Hold on, let me go back to that slide. Excuse me. All right. Here we go. Yeah, so it looks like when we compare the pre-pandemic to the early pandemic, people in Brazil and Brazil show higher change relative to France, and Italy shows lower change relative to France. While with pre-pandemic versus new normal analysis, the relative to France, Brazil and Italy show less change, and the U.S. shows more change. Now, what some really good feedback I've gotten so far on the paper is that the manifestation of the pandemic has varied in time across different countries. Like it hit some countries harder earlier, and others harder later, and so on. I'd love to look more in the future into the time element here is very much just like boom, like WHO declaration. Let's compare the before and the after. But if the analysis could be done in an even more nuanced way, for example, if we take into account, if we instead of doing a before and after relative to the global declaration, if we could at every country level make that before after comparison relative to say the first national lockdown in that country, the results might get a little more nuanced. But yeah, as it is now, like any starker country level differences might get a little watered down just because of that singular cutoff of the WHO declaration.
Yeah. And Italy, I mean, you mentioned Italy and Brazil, which have two of the worst experiences with COVID.
Yeah. So with Italy, like I was, while I was working on the revisions on the paper that I mentioned, like I was reading up more on the literature on Italy and how COVID hit Italy, and it would definitely be because like they were the first to like impose national lockdowns in Europe or something like that, and in many ways it seems like they would have experienced, because in relation to that they would have experienced more of like some of the psychological fallout or the media consumption fallout of the pandemic earlier than everyone else. And in a future study, it would definitely be interesting to really dig down into that granular level time related effects of time and country related effects on the outcome.
That's that sounds great. One of the things that struck me as odd is, was it a little counterintuitive that drama and horror would be viewing it would go down?
So I guess whether it's counterintuitive or not, whether it makes sense or not, kind of depends on like the philosophy, like the theory, for lack of a better word, that we buy into when it comes to how these socioeconomic distress events affect people. So like I mentioned earlier, like that theory that I meant, the environmental security hypothesis, I believe, yeah. So this basically says that people watch more serious stuff when stuff is serious, because they want to understand it better. But then the converse hypothesis, which some other scholars have looked into, is that when stuff is serious, when stuff is dark, people want to distract themselves. People want to watch fun stuff, and yeah, like that's partly what I was referring. This like seemingly going in different directions is kind of what I was referring to earlier when I said it's like where was it? Oh yeah, so drama and horror go down, which I feel like those two going down together kind of makes sense because it's like it's heavy stuff. It's heavy. Like it's. I mean, I'm sure there's like content out there marked as drama that is like funny and not super heavy, but when you think drama, you're thinking like tears and stuff like that. I feel like those two going down together, drama and horror going down together, like makes a little more sense. But then it's the adventure going down consistently that kind of makes me trip a little bit, and kind of like again goes back to like which theory are we supposed to buy into about how people's media consumption changed in periods of stress. The whole like more serious when serious, or more fun when serious. Yeah.
I for one was kind of looking forward to seeing Contagion on every year, like the new Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. Man, I mean, these days, like during the pandemic for sure, like that'd be a fun ritual. I think there's one more question in the Q&A. All right, so I'll read it out loud. Can you tell me more about this was from Chong Ho Yu. Can you tell me more about the TV Time app? How can the app track the TV viewing patterns? Does the smart TV send data to the app? Thanks. Okay, great question. So actually it's it's far simpler and more straightforward than that. It's very much a self-report app. So users download the app and then they, mark what they've seen as seen. At the episode level or at the movie level. We do have movie data, but this analysis focused entirely on TV shows. Yeah, so it's entirely self-report, and people can self-report not only consumption but also like they can rate the movie, they can rate the episode of the movie, they can mark down like what emotions it made them felt. They can also tell us what streaming platform they watched it on. As well. So we have all that data to work with to build our models with, which is really exciting.
Well, if there are no further questions, any last comments?
I'm good. Does anybody else have any like further questions or comments I could address? If you think about something later, because as these things happen, like I said, please feel free to add me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to correspond. Other than that, that's it for me.
Well, this has been a fascinating presentation. I think this is, as somebody who binge watches a lot of TV, mostly sports, but still as somebody who binge watches TV, this kind of hits me in the gut. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Yeah.
And Mrinmoy.
Yeah, so thanks everyone, and thanks Danny for wonderful presentation. So for the attendees, please complete the feedback form, so that will be posting in the chat window. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Bye-bye.